Over the next several lectures, we will start to look at the philosophical responses to determinism in relation to free will. We'll look at what kinds of theories philosophers have developed to try to accommodate or at least draw some conclusions about what it means to have free will in light of questions about determinism. And today's lecture will address the earliest manifestations of the view called libertarianism, the view that we have a kind of free will that is inconsistent with determinism. Now, libertarianism in the free will debate is not the kind of libertarianism that's associated with political philosophy, although, of course, both views celebrate liberty or freedom, and that's why they share a label. And of course, a libertarian about free will could be a libertarian about politics. Similarly, a libertarian about politics could be a libertarian about freedom. The views are independent. There doesn't have to be any particular allegiance anyway. In the free will debate, libertarian views make two central claims. One of them is that free will requires that determinism is false. That is, this is the statement I had in the initial lecture. If determinism is true, then we don't have free will. So according to libertarians, free will requires indeterminism. The second thesis that they hold is that we do in fact have free will. We have what it takes to be free. It turns out that we need to state these conditions separately because it's a complicated matter to get from the claim determinism is false to the conclusion, therefore there's free will. It's not that easy. So they need to be able to explain how indeterminism plays into our choices in such a way that we have free will. Today we'll look at the very earliest articulations of these views, and I always find it thrilling to consider the ancient history of these ideas. From the earliest texts in Western philosophy, we get these kinds of ideas of indeterminist freedom. Interestingly, by contrast, though, the problem of free will never achieved the kind of prominence in Chinese philosophy that it did in Western philosophy, even though Chinese philosophy is a richly developed tradition. And a large part of the explanation for this, why the problem of free will never arose to the kind of prominence in Chinese philosophy, is because the doctrine of determinism was never articulated very explicitly in Chinese philosophy. And so what seems to be one of the primary sources of the problem of free will never presented itself in a very threatening manner. By contrast, as we've seen in Greek philosophy, very early on, the atomists developed an explicitly deterministic view, and that seems to have been an important catalyst for developing explicitly indeterminist accounts of free will. A group of philosophers known as the Epicureans were perhaps the earliest philosophers to react against the deterministic worldview in a way that was tied up with free will. The school of Epicureanism was founded by the philosopher Epicurus, who lived from roughly 341 to 270 BCE. And Epicurus accepted much of the atomistic view of the universe that we saw in the last lecture. So he was a naturalist. He thought that there weren't any gods, there were no supernatural spirits, none of those phenomena needed to be invoked at all. So he accepted, in addition, that the only thing that exists are atoms and the void, just like the standard atomist. There's atoms and empty space, and that's it. Scholars disagree about whether Epicurus actually formulated an indeterminist view of free will. There are, as in many of these cases, there are limited surviving texts, and philosophers don't agree on whether Epicurus himself was really an indeterminist. But there's no question that his followers, who identified themselves as Epicureans, did advocate such a view of free will as in defiance of determinism. So the most famous instance here is the Roman poet Lucretius, who lived from 94 to 55 BCE, roughly. He identified as an Epicurean. He took himself to be a follower of Epicurus. And in his poem On the Nature of Things, he argues that determinism has to be false. He argues for indeterminism. And one of the arguments that he gives is that determinism has to be false because it precludes free will. And so he writes, suppose that every motion is always linked, and the new arises from the old in a fixed order. In that case, what is the source of this free will for all living things all over the earth? To our ears, that sounds pretty familiar and sensible, perhaps with the exception about it applying to all living things. I'm not sure we think that slugs get to defy the laws of nature or get to defy the deterministic laws. But this may be, with Lucretius, the earliest uncontroversial mention of a possible conflict between free will and determinism. Free will, according to Lucretius, lies in the individual's will. So what he says is that it is a person's will that generates movement. So after he tells us that determinism can't be true because it conflicts with this idea that we have free choice, he says the choice lies in a person's will, and that, quote, gives him a start for this movement. And from the will, the motions pass flooding through the limbs. We find a related passage in Epicurus, who says, this or that result at first depends on us without qualification. The idea of something depending on us will be critical as libertarian philosophy develops over the next 2,000 years. Epicurus also writes, we rebuke, oppose, and reform one another on the assumption that we have the cause in ourselves also, not merely in our initial constitution and in the random necessity of things that surround us. This suggests that Epicurus at least thought that the source of the initial cause was in the person. For this is the only reason, he thought, why we would hold ourselves responsible. That this is the only explanation for why we would think we were responsible for an action, because the source of the action was within us. Note, though, that this claim doesn't explicitly say that determinism is false. The passage from Epicurus, he only says that the cause is in us. So that doesn't yet tell us that somehow that cause is indeterminist. Lucretius does go on to make the explicit claim that determinism is false, though. What he says is that our free will is made possible by the fact that the atoms don't do the same thing all the time. Remember that Epicureans are basically atomists. They think that all that exists are atoms and empty space. And so what Lucretius says is, that's right, all there are atoms in empty space, but the atoms don't all do the same thing at the same time, in the same way. Sometimes they swerve. That's the technical term that they used. So here's the key passage from Lucretius. He says, the mind itself has no internal necessity in all it does, and this is because of, quote, the tiny swerve of the elements at no fixed place and at no fixed time. So we have all these atoms behaving in a regular fashion, but sometimes an atom out of the blue will swerve in some way that isn't determined by past motions. So that is in defiance of the determinist atomists like Leucippus and Democritus, and Lucretius thinks that that's the opening for free will. There was a further reason that the Epicureans thought that there had to be a swerve, something that might be thought to give it some extra plausibility. And in philosophy, it's always good to have some kind of independent argument for a thesis, especially one like this where you might think, boy, it would be really nice if determinism was false. And so they just say, yeah, it is false. So we have free will. So if there was some independent reason to believe that determinism was false, that would help the case. And what Lucretius maintained was that you did need an additional indeterminist element. Some atomists had thought that all the atoms were moving in the same direction, namely down, at the same speed, but it was also widely presumed that the atoms interacted, that is, they collided. But if they're all moving down at the same speed, then the worry was there would never be an occasion for a collision. So they had to introduce the swerve to explain how you could get collisions at all. And so the swerve is introduced both to solve a problem about how the atoms might interact, so a kind of a problem about metaphysics, and also, more famously, to provide a basis for free will. The swerve provides the basis for free choice. But now we get a problem that will reappear throughout the history of the free will debate. And that is that if it's just a swerve in the atoms, it doesn't seem like it comes from the person's character. It's just a random thing that happens. And so the worry is, this doesn't look so far like it's going to get us the kind of free will that we want. Now, this idea that there are these atoms and that they swerve in random ways actually resembles, in interesting ways, certain contemporary views of physics, that basic physical particles behave in truly random ways. Lucretius says little about how indeterminism fits into the mind, and that's obviously a big part of the picture here that we need to fill out. A couple of centuries later, a philosopher named Alexander of Aphrodisias developed a more full account of a libertarian philosophy. Alexander was a Greek philosopher who was devoted to defending and commenting on the earlier Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE. This practice of identifying with and advocating the views of a previous philosopher was common and widely accepted, and we've already seen it with Lucretius. Lucretius just was an Epicurean. All he claimed to be doing was elaborating on what Epicurus had developed. And so that is how Alexander regarded himself with respect to Aristotle. The followers of Aristotle were known as peripatetics, allegedly because of their practice of walking while doing philosophy. Alexander explicitly rejects determinism for decisions, that he's very clear. And what he says is, we have this power in actions that we can choose the opposite. And that claim is new. That's not something that was said explicitly by Lucretius. So Alexander says, when I make a choice, I could also have done the opposite. And he goes on to say, when I say that something depends on me, what I'm saying is that I have in me the power of also choosing the opposite. The idea that he's trying to communicate here is that even with everything exactly the same, with exactly the same situation, I can choose one thing or choose the opposite. And this is in direct contradiction to determinism. In the version that we saw in the last lecture, if you'll recall, I said, imagine that there are two worlds that are in exactly the same state. You're supposed to say, there are these two worlds in the same state that are exactly parallel. So let's think about that for our own world. Suppose there's another world that's exactly parallel to ours at this very moment. There's even a duplicate of each of us in the other world. So there's a duplicate of me, there's a duplicate of my wife, there's a duplicate of my dad. All of us have exact duplicates. Determinism says that anything I do will be exactly paralleled by what my counterpart does, and anything my dad does will be exactly paralleled by his counterpart. Alexander is denying this. He's saying that with everything exactly the same, I can do one thing or do the opposite. Or to stick with the two-universe example, even if everything has been the same up until now in the two worlds, I can do the opposite of what my counterpart in the other world does. And that is a robust rejection of determinism. Alexander even suggests that a person can act in ways that defy what their character dictates. So he relates a story in which the philosopher Socrates says that his own nature inclined him in one direction. His own character was pushing him in one direction, but he had, quote, through discipline that comes from philosophy, become better than his nature. This idea, according to Alexander, is really central to the libertarian philosophy he wants to defend. The idea that we are free to defy our character. That is part of what it is to have libertarian freedom. That is a major theme in libertarianism in the 20th century. So that's his claim. His claim is that we have this special kind of free will, the freedom to do the opposite. What are the arguments for this? What are the arguments that we really have this kind of free will? And Alexander argues for this view on the basis of characteristics of deliberation, of the process of walking through a decision, working through the problem, trying to figure out the right answer. And the right answer for, say, how to act. If determinism is true, Alexander says, deliberation is just futile. And so he writes, if all the things that come to be follow on causes that have been laid down beforehand, then men deliberate in vain about the things that they have to do. Alexander maintains that deliberation is obviously useful. And he says you can see this by contrasting our situation with those of other living creatures. Other animals, he says, they don't adequately consider the various options before them. Humans, on the other hand, deliberate about which option is really best. We think things through and decide on the basis of serious reflection, and that sets us apart. So he says deliberation is not futile. Its utility is obvious from our superiority over animals when we engage in decision-making. He goes on to say, it would be absurd for us to deliberate about things if we agree that they're necessary, because, quote, no advantage would come to us from deliberating about them. The only point of deliberation is that the future options are open to us, says Alexander. Neither do we deliberate about things we did in the past, Alexander says, because it doesn't make any sense to deliberate about things in the past, like, I wonder what I should wear yesterday. Too late. We can't do anything about that. So Alexander says, we deliberate only about things which are both done by us and future, clearly on the grounds that we will gain something from this deliberating for the choice and doing of the action. So Alexander thinks that deliberation provides the key link to understanding free will and its relation to determinism. And this brings up again the lazy argument that we've seen in a previous lecture. The lazy argument maintains that if determinism is true, then there's no point in making any efforts. There's no point because what's going to happen is going to happen. There's no way of avoiding what's going to happen. And so that would include making any effort at deliberating. There's no particular reason in going to the work of deliberating. We saw a quick dismissal of this argument. However, there might be a deeper concern behind the lazy argument. The advocate of the lazy argument might point out that if determinism is right, as the Stoics maintain, then no deliberation is possible because nothing is genuinely open. For with Alexander, we might say that we only deliberate because we assume that our options are genuinely open. It seems that Alexander is right about something here. When we deliberate, we do it with the expectation that it will make a difference. We never deliberate when it's obvious that it can't make a difference. That's why his example about deliberating about things in the past is so convincing. But we need to be careful about what we can conclude from this argument. One thing seems clear. A determinist can allow that deliberation does in fact make a difference. A determinist might look at two individuals, one of whom is determined to deliberate and the other determined to react impulsively to every little temptation. The determinist will certainly be able to acknowledge that the deliberator does better than the impulsive person. A creature who's determined to deliberate will often outperform an individual who doesn't. So deliberation, sifting through reasons, trying to find the best way to go, that often can make a difference to performance, even if it's determined. I don't mean to suggest that that's the end of the story on the lazy argument and deliberation. Far from it. There remains something disturbing about the idea of deliberation if determinism is true. But at this point, we need to grant the determinist that deliberation can have causal consequences. And I want to make this point in one more way, because it's very significant and it's important to get clear on this. A determinist can look back on a past event, say the formation of Hurricane Katrina, and say that, of course, the air temperature and the water temperature played important causal roles in the production of Katrina. But the determinist says those causes themselves, the air and water temperature, were determined by past events. Similarly, the determinist can say that deliberation plays an important causal role in the production of behavior, that it matters whether the person deliberated or not to what action they produced, but the factors that go into deliberation were themselves determined by past events, just like the air temperature and water temperature were determined by past events in the case of Katrina. Alexander has a second kind of argument, and that is that it's only because we could have acted otherwise, he says, that we ever feel regret for our actions. The fact that we regret our actions, he says, shows that we could have done otherwise. And he says this is because, quote, it's on the grounds that it was possible for us also not to have chosen that That's why we feel regret. That's why we blame ourselves for our decision. This argument also makes an important contribution. It's like the earlier passage from Epicurus. It states something quite plausible. We typically only blame ourselves, at least we only blame ourselves in a sort of reflective sense, when we think that we could have done otherwise. But if this is to be an argument for free will, we need something stronger than that. His argument might work to establish that we only regret our actions because we think it's possible that we could have done something else. But they don't show that we only regret our actions because we, in fact, really could have done something else. Another way to put this point is that Alexander's arguments are largely convincing only at the descriptive level, not the substantive level. He makes a good case that we only regret our actions because we think that they're not determined. That would suggest that at the descriptive level, the libertarian is right that free will requires indeterminism. But the arguments are not persuasive on the substantive level. They provide little reason to think that our decisions really aren't determined. Alexander's arguments in favor of libertarian free will don't convince many contemporary philosophers, but he certainly deserves credit for formulating one of the earliest clearly libertarian theories of free will. And of course, the theory might be right even if the arguments are bad. Although there was a great deal of further debate about free will among the Greeks and the Romans, the next major development for libertarianism emerges in the medieval era. Medieval philosophers developed a new kind of argument against determinism based on what they called the liberty of indifference. And it was driven by a thought experiment that was attributed to Jean Buridan, who lived from 1300 to 1358. Buridan had us imagine a hungry donkey that is equally far from two equally delicious-looking piles of hay. With no basis for choosing between the options, the idea was that the donkey would just starve to death. And this thought experiment is called Buridan's ass, although the thought experiment goes back further to the Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali who lived from 1058 to 1111. Although neither Ghazali nor Buridan appealed to this thought experiment to argue for free will, it's used by other medieval philosophers, Peter Olivy, who lived from 1248 to 1298, and Duns Scotus, who lived from 1266 to 1308. They used it to defend a libertarian notion of freedom that is called, as I said, the liberty of indifference. And this is the kind of free will that they thought that's required to break ties. Their point is that we do have this ability to break ties. If we were faced, let's say, hay isn't so attractive to us, let's say we're faced with two equally appealing apples. It's not like we'd be frozen in indecision. The free will to decide between equally attractive alternatives, they say, that is the liberty of indifference. You're indifferent between these two options, and you choose one anyway. These philosophers thought that the situation with animals is very different. For they thought animals don't have this kind of free will. They don't have free will in the important sense. And this shows up, according to Olivy, a critical difference between beasts and man. The beast, he suggested, would starve to death in this case, while the man would be able to exercise his free will and eat the apple. Moreover, Olivy maintained that if the donkey did manage to move, it would have to be by a process that was different from the one that we use. And that's because the donkey can't deliberate between equal options and then resolve to carry out one of the options. That's something that is distinctively human. Furthermore, Olivy maintains that the donkey actually doesn't get in this situation because his senses and appetite won't ever present him with an equally balanced option to begin with. These particular views about the animals now seem fairly quaint, really. To be sure, there's no reason to think that any animal ever starved or even went hungry because of such a dilemma. If humans can solve this problem of the equally attractive alternatives, it seems animals can do it as well. That doesn't mean that animals and humans do it in the same way, and that was a large part of the point of the philosophers. In any case, the idea of the liberty of indifference is new and really intriguing. For one thing, the situation they're painting seems like it really could arise. One really could be presented with equally attractive options, as far as it seems to you. And it seems like if that did happen, we wouldn't have any trouble making a decision. I'm not saying that it really does happen that we get faced with this kind of choice, but it would seem that the burden of proof has shifted, at least somewhat, back to the person who wants to sustain determinism. There have, however, been a number of objections to this view of the liberty of indifference. One objection is that few, if any, free choices are really like this. Furthermore, philosophers point out that the outcome of the choice is the same in either case. You're going to get an apple in either case. So it doesn't make it's not a significant choice. It's not anything that has moral weight. I think this is a little bit hasty. The thought experiment is really supposed to, this argument, the thought experiment is supposed to reveal a clear case that involves free will. If the libertarians win this case, then they can say, we've now proved the existence of a kind of free will. And it's plausible once we have that proof that we can say, and we exercise it more broadly in lots of other cases. But this case, we can sort of take our stand here and say, here's a case of clear free will, and it applies in lots of other cases as well. So what the philosophers want to do is show free will in this case, and then say we can extend it to other cases as well. But even if they win that battle, there are other battles to face them. So some philosophers maintain that liberty of indifference is a defective idea because the idea of will, of making the will yours, doesn't have to do any work. You could just flip a coin. That would be equally effective for getting the apple on the left or the apple on the right. Now, even that objection seems like it may not be so devastating, because what matters is not that it could have been done with a coin flip, but the question is whether it was done with something like a coin flip. If instead my will does it, if I make the decision, then maybe I still do own the choice. So even though you might not need a will to make a random choice, it's possible that you actually do it yourself. It's not done by some kind of outsourced coin flipping procedure. But the randomness problem is obviously in the air here. The problem we've seen in a previous lecture. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, for instance, says that the liberty of indifference is just absurd, because now what we have is just randomness. All you've done is you've introduced randomness into the decision-making process, and that isn't going to help. A different kind of response that's interesting comes from steadfast determinists who really want to hold on to the idea of determinism. And some of these just denied the possibility. They said you could never have a perfectly balanced option. They said that there would always have to be some, maybe really tiny difference that would tip the scale. Maybe one of the piles has a slightly more juicy piece of hay. But it's really hard to see an argument for why this should be impossible. As in the previous lecture, it seems like the justification for making such a statement, the justification for saying you couldn't possibly have equally balanced alternatives, is because of a prior conviction in determinism. There's no independent reason to think that it's impossible for a donkey to perceive two options as equally attractive. A further objection that's made against this is that while the situation might appear identical to the person or the donkey making the decision, that doesn't exclude the possibility that what actually tips the scale is deterministic at a lower level, below the level of psychological accessibility. Maybe at the level of neurons or neurotransmitters or ion channels or what have you, that when you look further down into the human organism, you will find that what looked like it was a totally free choice was really guided by some lower level processes. On the one hand, you might say, well, this is just like the last response. It just presumes that determinism is true. But this objection, I think, really does pose an important threat, because it challenges the libertarian to justify his assumption that just because a person can make a choice when it seems to him that everything is the same, means that the choice is not determined by other factors outside of conscious awareness. This is an important problem because, as we'll see in later lectures, much of what happens in our mind is outside of conscious awareness. And so it's not clear that we can draw any quick conclusions from the fact that we can make choices when the options seem equally attractive. So let me say that one more time. The person who advocates the liberty of indifference says, it seems to me like the options are equally attractive and yet I still make a choice. Therefore, determinism is false. But what it seems to you like, how it seems to you, may miss out on a lot of important factors that happen below the level of consciousness, and those factors may really be deterministic. So there have been a lot of objections to this approach to libertarianism, but it's by no means a dead view. As we'll see in Lecture 11, recent neuroscience work actually provides some reason to reconsider the prospects for something like the liberty of indifference. In any case, it's an important milestone in the development of libertarian philosophy because it provides a new kind of argument for why we should believe that we have a kind of free will that defies determinism.